It's Halloween, and yet again we find ourselves confronted with the abject terror of video game reviews with horrifically subjective number scores. And Bumpkus Bites remains your solitary light in the darkness, or, in the case of Silent Hill 2 Remake, your haggard 2x4 with nails, haphazardly hammered into one end. Let's get into another video game food review. Silent Hill 2 Remake. Rarely has a game evoked such a profound sense of unease, dread, and sadness. It was honestly a little draining to play through. While my overall feelings are definitely positive, this shouldn't be misconstrued as a universal recommendation. It certainly gets dark. I'd say play and watch at your own risk. We'll start off with gameplay. Silent Hill 2 Remake sees the player wandering through the town of Silent Hill as James Sunderland looking for his wife Mary. This is fairly standard contemporary third-person survival horror fare, which means you'll be scouring environments for resources with which to fight on and progress in the story, checking corners for enemies, and desk drawers for a combination to a safe that has a key that unlocks a door leading to a puzzle, gating a boss fight that allows you to access a new part of the town. If that sounds ridiculous, well, it is, and it's not an exaggeration. At one point in the game, you come into an office where there's a thing that requires 3 key items from other parts of the location to open. Inside is another key, which literally just unlocks a thing in an adjoining room, and it just contains the solution for a puzzle, and yet another adjoining room. It seems like there's an opportunity for consolidation here. I'm okay with parts of this world being absurd and unrealistic, but it has to maintain some link with reality to stay connected with the player. The game even demonstrates some self-awareness of the puzzle absurdity, when at one point you use 3 different key items to open a chest, again, and the chest is just empty. But the story advances anyway. It feels like an acknowledgement of the problem without any attempts to remedy it. The gunplay is great. Weapons have a sensible amount of unwieldiness to them while still feeling satisfying to control. You have a melee weapon too, and it's similarly weighty. With the intention of conserving ammo, I spent a lot of time in melee combat. The flow of it is just right, usually consisting of taking 1 or 2 swings, dodging an enemy attack, more swings, more dodging, and so on. That may not sound exciting, but the experience is enhanced with the knowledge that you're playing efficiently and not using precious ammo. Though depending on the difficulty and how much you explore, ammo may not be all that precious. I played on normal, and I had a very comfortable supply of ammo for the entire game. Speaking of which, exploration is super rewarding. Ammo and healing items are absolutely everywhere. While yeah, that's weird, that's Silent Hill, baby. And ignoring the absurdity of ammo in a motel bathroom, the balance of exploration rewards is pretty good too. You won't find healing items on every car seat, but you'll find healing items on approximately 25% of car seats, giving you sufficient reason to neurotically comb through every inch of Silent Hill looking for stuff. Early on, James picks up a radio, which is the mechanism by which the player is alerted to the presence of nearby enemies, except for when it just doesn't work. Sometimes this is intentional, as is the case with enemies of a certain type that contort themselves to hide behind certain objects. There aren't a whole lot of jump scares in the game, but I jolted in my chair at least once when one of these got me. I think that's an effective and justified method of subversion. What is most certainly not is the radio rapidly going in and out when enemies skate around near the end of its range, which happens quite a bit. I'll talk about it more when I talk about audio, but it's annoying. I looked for an option to turn it off, but there just isn't one. But there's an achievement for not picking it up, so I guess that's a thing. Speaking of enemies, they're mostly varied and fun to fight, and the fact that they occasionally get back up later is pleasantly creepy. The game would have benefited from maybe 1 or 2 more designs. I mean, 3 enemy types are just alternate versions of another, usually rotated 90 degrees, but I wouldn't say it's a prevalent problem. Bosses are good. Everyone knows Pyramid Head, of course, and there are a few others. Having a dodge might trivialize these encounters for some players, but I'm honestly thankful for any help I can get in horror games. The main problem I have is that the final boss is a repeat encounter, and I don't think the reused design makes thematic sense. While the boss encounters in general aren't wildly unique and interesting, the context in which some of them reside is. I have some complaints about the pacing of the game and its build-up and release of tension, but I think those may fit more solidly under story, so I'll put off talking about that aspect until later. I rate gameplay. One of those frozen veggie bean burgers that would really hit the spot if it just had some solid condiments to accompany it. Let's do audio next. I really have to praise the music here. It's mostly used during cutscenes, but whenever it's utilized, it so effectively conveys a sense of melancholy and mystery.
Didn't you say she died?
Oh. Yeah. 3 years ago. It's just... I got a letter from her.
It's beautiful. I can see myself listening to it when I'm not playing the game, except for the 2 or 3 tracks like this. Honestly, never bring that around here again. Music ratcheting up tension when there's nothing on screen to justify it is one of the most grievous sins in the horror genre, and it's literally on a short loop here. I don't understand how anyone could see this experience and think it's a good idea. Mastery of some of the basic elements of horror will come up later too. Sound effects are good. Moans, groans, and the like are appropriately creepy. There's a rainstorm raging outside when night comes around, and it's a dark joy to stop and listen to during otherwise quiet moments in that segment of the game. As previously mentioned, the radio that signals enemies are nearby is choppy. It can be fairly loud when enemies are very close, and if you're using a PS5 controller, the sound comes partially from the DualSense itself. This makes those portions where the radio keeps going in and out particularly infuriating, and I couldn't find an option to mute the controller sounds. If this wasn't a central mechanism of the game, or if the game were just significantly shorter, it wouldn't be a big deal, but the radio goes off in every encounter, so the fact that it randomly does things like this roughly 10% of the time means that it happens 20 times in a playthrough. Irate audio. A fried hand pie, where the first and last couple bites are spent looking for the filling and just getting crust, but the bites in the middle are absolute bliss. Visual design and user interface. Okay, related to my point about the unevenness of the audio, the inconsistency of windows and other glass panes in this game is frustrating, though admittedly probably not a big deal. See, some of the glass panes in the game are breakable, and it's so satisfying to do, but then other windows are not, and there's an opaque glaze over them. Part of me understands that this is done to communicate to the player, hey, don't look at this glass, there's nothing behind here and no need to waste your time, but the other part yearns for more uniformity in design, especially in a game world that's really well rendered. It's the fact that breakable and unbreakable windows can be side by side. There's also a late game area with fire hoses behind glass throughout. They look near identical, yet the glass is breakable on some of them while it's not breakable on the others. Okay. That's enough time dedicated to the destructibility of glass. Enemy designs are pretty good. They're very unsettling, which is clearly the intention. The fog looks really good, and it helps set the tone of the whole game. It's also used effectively to obscure objects, places, and enemies in your environment. Textures in general look fine. I don't have strong opinions about non-stylized, high-fidelity graphics, but I don't regard them as bad at all. I really like the garden and park environments. They provide welcome respites from the rust and rot that dominate much of the game. There's just so much brown and gray here. Sometimes it's broken up by red or a sickly yellow-green, but these colors are really only used for grotesque effect. I would have really appreciated the use of more color. I get that the game is supposed to be dreadful and oppressive, but I think breaking up the monotony and introducing more contrast would have better emphasized the emotional lows the game wants to convey. More on that later. The user interface is good. It's pretty minimalist, which is for the best. Bringing up the larger inventory is sort of weird. It seems to always land you on a different category and or a different object. I kept thinking it must be based on what you're currently doing, but it never behaved quite like I expected it to. It's not a big deal, just weird. Irate visual design and user interface. Some B-tier turkey stuffing, where you really enjoy the first few bites, but then you feel an encroaching sense of dread as you realize your plate is like half stuffing, and this is all there is. Ooh, spooky. Now setting. The fog and decrepitude of Silent Hill really seep in during your time with the game. It's fitting given what's going on, and it's certainly immersive. The game takes place over the span of maybe 24 hours too, which is cool. A lot of horror games like this start early evening and end at daybreak, but this goes past that. The fact that sunrise comes and goes unceremoniously is honestly spooky in its own right, and plays with convention in a way that I think is really neat. Because I've touched on setting in previous topics, and because it's tough to talk more about the town of Silent Hill without spoiling anything, I'll end it there. Suffice to say that I really enjoyed the setting and what they did with it. I rate setting a warm, delicious dinner roll that could just use a bit of butter. We'll end with story. James comes to Silent Hill at the behest of a recent letter from his wife, Mary, who allegedly died 3 years prior from an unnamed illness. The letter says that Mary is waiting for James in the once cozy, maybe, town of Silent Hill, which they spent some time in years ago. So despite everything and everyone warning him away, he goes around town looking for her. This ties into one of the game's central themes, grief. Yes, this is obviously a bad place to hang around, but James does so anyway on the off chance that he can see his wife again. Grief makes people do odd things. James meets a handful of other characters throughout his time in Silent Hill. Each has their own struggles, and their stories are all effective and emotional. The character arcs speak to Silent Hill's purpose and hint at why James is truly here. I think these characters and their use throughout the game are done perfectly. They're really the only means of breaking up the constant feeling of loneliness and dread, though they never quite remedy both at once. That brings me to the aforementioned topic of the build-up and release of tension. Horror, in my opinion, is most effective when there's a significant contrast between the emotional highs and lows of the story. If the protagonist of the story, and by extension the audience, never feels safe in it, they feel the same relative level of fear throughout. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does keep a horror story from reaching great heights. For example, I read Pet Sematary by Stephen King recently. It's maybe one of the bleakest books I've read, and I think this is in large part due to the fact that King spends at least the first half of the book setting up this idyllic life for his protagonist and other people in the story. The latter parts of the book hit so hard emotionally because they stand in such contrast with what came before. To take it back to video games, The Evil Within and Resident Evil have save points in dedicated areas with musical cues. Setting up these conventions trains the player to associate save rooms with a safe space. This has the effect of both calming the player to prepare them for whatever's next, and creating a lower tension baseline. If the player is always tense because there's no tension relief, there's less room for their tension to grow. If there are periods of cooldown where they can reset, the difference between their tension baseline and peak is going to be greater, and scares are going to be much more impactful. Silent Hill 2 Remake has these moments of tension relief theoretically. It has those character interaction cutscenes and a couple of segments where you don't see any enemies for a while as you wander through an environment, but these are few and far between. What's more, there's no such aural or visual indicator of safety for the player. Maybe you won't see any enemies for the next 10 minutes while you wander through this parking lot, but you have no idea that's the case. So you're still checking your corners, making sure you've reloaded your weapons, and are just generally on high alert. You're still tense. As for Silent Hill 2's save points, they're sometimes just out in the open. Even when they're not, there's no guarantee you're actually safe, as enemies can go anywhere, which also means your radio is potentially blaring whenever you save your game. I just wish there were more tension relief moments in the game, so that the oppressive atmosphere and dread-inducing story moments could have shown through more. Since I don't want to spoil anything, I won't delve further into the story. I will say there are multiple endings, and the way in which you achieve these isn't an exact science. It's not a matter of choose this path, pick up this item. It's based on your playthrough as a whole, which is an intriguing prospect to me. After finishing the game and looking at the various endings, I feel confident I at least know how I got my ending, which, for the record, is regarded as the worst ending. And my satisfaction with it tells me it's safe to say that no ending feels unearned, which is a common pitfall for games with multiple endings. I'm sad thinking about it now. I rate story: the bowl or bowls of ice cream you eat after a breakup. Okay, so we've reached the end of the review, and it's time to find out what food encompasses Silent Hill 2 Remake as a whole. We bring together our ingredients: the bland veggie burger, underfilled hand pie, too much unremarkable stuffing, dried dinner roll, and breakup ice cream. Combined, these form, I've got it, a hearty soup on a cold night when you're just feeling lonely. It carries an inherent sense of satisfaction mixed with sadness and a yearning for something more. And this has been a particularly dour Bumpkus Bites review, the only objective reviews on the internet and your source of absolutely true opinions. Thanks so much for watching. Join me next time for my review of Firewatch. That seems like a good autumnal video game that should hopefully be less sad. Please like and subscribe if you would like to. Oh, and feel free to leave a comment showering me with praise or whatever. Thanks again, and happy Halloween. Oh, and the soup was spooky soup.